Sequelitis. It's a thing. While, yes, everyone's opinions on films will be different and will be based on their own personal experiences and views, there are objective meters like Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, or CinemaScore that give us a better idea of what the general public is feeling about a given film. And statistically speaking, you'll find that a very small minority of films that attempt to make a sequel will perform as well, if not better, critically among audiences and critics. Again, I'm not talking about personal opinions, which are completely valid, and you may feel certain sequels are better than the original. I'm just talking about the public perception and statistical evidence. The first Avengers has a 92% critic score and a 91% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Age of Ultron, directed by the same director and made largely with the same cast, unlike Infinity War and Endgame, which switched directors and added a much larger cast, has a 75% critic score. Statistically speaking, Age of Ultron performed worse than the first Avengers, as did Transformers 1 and 2, as did Jurassic Park 1 and 2, Pirates of the Caribbean 1 and 2, Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, Iron Man and Guardians 1 and 2, you get the idea. Again, I have to stress that in all of these cases, the sequels were largely made with the same director and vision in mind. It may not be quite as fair to compare Thor and Thor the Dark World because the directors had changed and so did the vision, so it's more like looking at standalone films in that case. At any rate, yes, all that to say, making a good sequel is hard. It's really hard. The fact that we have films like Shrek 2, The Two Towers, and of course The Empire Strikes Back, again based not in my own opinion but in statistics, is Herculean. But as you've probably noticed by the title of this video, I'm not necessarily here to talk about the task of making a better sequel, which may very well be a topic of conversation for another day. In today's video, I want to pinpoint one very particular flaw that has permeated throughout film culture in the past few decades. In fact, this video has very little to do with the sequel itself, but rather with the film that preceded it. Follow me here. After the likes of The Empire Strikes Back, Aliens, Terminator 2, and Back to the Future 2, the film industry entered the 21st century with a huge appetite for sequels. These films prove that making not only a critically successful film, but also a lucrative sequel was not only possible, but it was hugely rewarding because it built up goodwill amongst the fanbase, as well as did what most executives are looking for, which is bring in a huge amount of money. As such, what we saw in the 2000s and the 2010s was an increase in a phenomenon only accentuated tenfold by the success of this idea of a shared cinematic universe that was pioneered by Marvel. And that was making a first film with the sequel already in mind, which was virtually unheard of before the 2000s. Now, when you're writing books, let's say, it might not be as big of a deal versus making a movie to plan out the sequel ahead. In fact, a book may benefit greatly from having a centralized vision for the entire story simply because of the expanded real estate. Not only can you set up an entire series of 7 stories, but you can also create your own perfectly functional narrative within the same capsule. Movies don't necessarily have that real estate. 2 hours isn't a lot of time, as weird as it may be to say. You don't necessarily have the luxury of meandering about, laying clever threads to 10 future installments. You have to hit the ground running. What is one common thread that all of those aforementioned successful first films have in common? They were not concerned with setting up the next film in the franchise. Now, granted, for some of the cases that I've listed above, the failure of the sequel had nothing to do with setting up the franchise. For example, I personally think that the second Guardians film is just inferior as a film, and statistically most people do as well, as indicated by the lower critic scores. But to me, that has nothing to do with trying to set up a sequel or expand the universe. But let's look at 2 films that were burdened with this problem, both superhero films released in the last 10 years, and they were released amongst this crazy sequel craze. Let's look at Avengers Age of Ultron and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. You'll find an interesting common thread between the two actually when you look at their desires to set up sequels and future franchise films, as well as even spin-offs. It's not necessarily the director's fault that it turned out this way. It actually falls on the studio and the corporations. Let me explain. With Avengers Age of Ultron, Marvel knew that they were at a critical juncture. They had established themselves as successful, perhaps not to the point where people would just take everything that they sold, but they were getting close to that point. Keep in mind that Age of Ultron's story was in development and finished long before the first Guardians was released, largely considered Marvel's first risk. So what do? Kevin Feige has this grand plan, this plan for Infinity War, and he has plans for many other side projects going forward, like Thor Ragnarok. What does the company do? They force Joss Whedon to include an exorbitant amount of hints towards the future of the MCU. There's Cap and Tony's argument, which maybe felt more natural in the first Avengers, but now just feels like a rehash preparing the audience for Civil War. How about Thor's vision in the cave scene, which had no real narrative purpose other than introducing Vision, who in himself was a setup for Infinity War? How about sending Hulk off to space? How about adding in Ulysses Claw? How about making a new Avengers team? If you look at Age of Ultron, it was really Joss Whedon trying to force all these things together that he was mandated to include, and then underneath that tangled web, he tried to weave in his own narrative. Remember when Black Panther was coming out? The final film before Infinity War, and we still hadn't seen the Soul Stone. What were we all saying before the film? Where's the Soul Stone? Is it going to show up in Black Panther? Is the heart-shaped herb the Soul Stone? Is vibranium the Soul Stone? And guess what Ryan Coogler said? He said, I don't care about that because that's not part of my movie. And you know what? I'm willing to bet that Black Panther was at least 10 times better because it didn't care about any of that and just decided to be its own film. Let's look at The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I mean, the entire villain plot was just an abandoned attempt to set up the Sinister Six. The inclusion of Rhino, Electro, Green Goblin, some mysterious benefactor, Norman Osborn, Vulture Wings, and Doc Ock Arms in the same film, they weren't even trying to hide it. And because of that, the film suffered. Because it couldn't decide which villain to give the central spotlight and subsequently destroyed them all at once. Now, where have we seen this before in a Spider-Man film? That's right. And it was only 7 years earlier by the same studio. Look at how much better it's working with Marvel. Each film builds up one outstanding villain with a couple of other minor ones in there as well, and now fans are excited for a Sinister Six. Don't just show us Vulture Wings, Sony, because no one cares about that at all if all you're going to do is just show it to us and not make enough money to warrant a sequel in the first place. And perhaps the single most egregious example of this was the Universal Shared Monster Universe that imploded so spectacularly. They literally had a panel with a ton of A-list stars preparing to be in upcoming monster movies like Johnny Depp, Tom Cruise, and Russell Crowe. And that was before a single movie had been released. So what happens? The Mummy, their first in the franchise, is released and it bombs. Because guess what? While it was too busy trying to include Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll, it forgot to make a legitimately good movie, and their entire plan crumbled. In order to make a good film, yes, if your franchise has the potential to move forward, then keep one eye on the horizon. But keep both feet firmly planted in the here and now. It's hard enough to make a good film to begin with, and then with the studios pressuring artists and creatives to bank upon a given IP to make a successful sequel, the task becomes nearly impossible. Corporate greed has forced out some of the most atrocious pieces of blockbuster filmmaking in the last few decades. The desire to make money, to capitalize on a popular or recognizable name, it's still extremely strong. And yet, in all of this, I feel like artists' visions have been stifled. Why do you think Infinity War and Endgame were so profitable? Because they weren't made to maximize profit. They were made to please an adoring fanbase that time and time again had been rewarded for their faith in the directors and the cast of these films. And then they made a huge profit. Setting up a sequel, or sequels, is not a sin in itself, but it's important to firstly and foremostly make a good film. Comment down below with your favorite movie sequel. I'd love to know what you guys think. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. While you're at it, make sure to check out the videos on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.